Welcome back. Today we're diving into a masterclass on something absolutely crucial: how our digital information ecosystem actually shapes our societal behavior. We're going to peel back the layers of influence, looking at the hardcore academic theories that define modern communication, and figure out exactly how our very perception of reality gets engineered from the top down.
So let's kick things off with a quote from family therapist Virginia Satir. "Perception can be more powerful than reality." This is the ultimate hook for what we're looking at today. You see, there's a massive gap between the physical sensations we experience out in the world and how our brain actually pieces them together to create awareness. The reality is, well, actual reality doesn't dictate human behavior. Our perception of it does.
To really get this, we have to contrast the world outside our window with the media reality we consume every single day. Actual reality is diverse, factual, multidimensional. But the reality on our screens? It's highly selective. It's totally constructed. Every piece of information has to pass through a gate. And those gatekeepers, whether we're talking about old-school news editors or today's social media algorithms, they are actively filtering, discarding, and deciding exactly which stories make it to your eyeballs.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, the battlefield of the mind. Then, cultivating a new reality, the spiral of silence, managing your perception, the tactics of persuasion, and finally, reclaiming your reality. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The battlefield of the mind. The core idea here is incredibly simple, but powerful. Whoever controls perception controls the battlefield.
Moving on to Section 2. Cultivating a new reality. This is where we break down the first major academic framework showing how a skewed worldview is built on a massive scale.
Back in 1968, George Gerbner gave us cultivation theory. His argument was that media, television, specifically at the time, acts as this centralized storytelling system. It isn't just entertaining us, it is systematically cultivating a specific worldview over time. And here's the wild part. Even if that worldview is totally inaccurate according to the data, it becomes a social reality anyway. Heavy viewers believe it's true, and they start basing their everyday judgments on it.
So what happens when these media symbols just drown out everything else? Gerbner called this mainstreaming. Heavy viewers basically converge onto that dominant media narrative. And because media loves to highlight violence and conflict, if it bleeds, it leads, viewers develop what's called mean world syndrome. They start believing the world is a vastly more dangerous place than the empirical data actually shows. This triggers intense anxiety, fear, and an outsized desire for protection.
Let's ground this with a real, visceral example. Think about the post-9/11 media landscape. Western media narratives were cultivating intense, constant fear. Now, for the families of victims or people living in those heavily affected areas, that media narrative perfectly aligned with their actual everyday reality. The theory calls this resonance, so they get a double dose of cultivation. It deeply shaped long-term perceptions, especially regarding Islam, and basically manufactured a reality completely rooted in that mean world syndrome.
Section 3. The spiral of silence. Okay, so if cultivation theory builds this reality, what happens when society is actually forced to accept it?
This brings us to the enforcement mechanism. Elizabeth Noel Neumann formulated the spiral of silence theory in 1974, and it forms this perfect, kind of terrifying symbiotic loop with cultivation theory. Think of it in steps. First, the media cultivates that fearful, mean world consensus. Second, it presents that view as the overwhelming, undeniable majority. Third, anyone with a dissenting opinion suddenly feels like they're totally alone in the minority. And because humans have this profound, hardwired fear of social isolation, they choose to suppress their contrasting opinions. Step 4. The silent spirals. And that cultivated narrative becomes the only acceptable truth.
The chilling macro-level effect of this dynamic is that the media can literally silence public discourse. Simply by declaring certain topics completely settled, rational individuals will actively choose to stay quiet. Their fear of being ostracized completely overrides their desire to speak their truth. It's essentially manufactured consent, driven entirely by the fear of being left alone.
Section 4. Managing your perception. Let's shift gears to the strategic command layer. How exactly do state and corporate actors intentionally bypass our cognitive defenses?
Right, so we live in this era of total information overload, what experts call information disorder. To manage our perception, actors weaponize 3 very specific types of pollution. First up, misinformation. This is false info, but it's shared with absolutely no intent to harm. Just an honest mistake. Second, disinformation. fabricated info deliberately designed to deceive you. And third, malinformation. Genuine reality-based data, like a private leak, that gets strategically repurposed to cause maximum damage. Getting these straight is absolutely vital.
To deploy this disorder effectively, strategists use classic deception. Major Jock Haswell laid out 5 main techniques. You've got the lure, which presents an exploitable advantage; the repetitive process, which conditions a target through harmless behavior to mask the real operation; the unintentional mistake, tricking a target into thinking they intercepted a lucky, accidental leak; the obvious solution, which fakes a totally predictable course of action; and bad luck, blaming a targeted anomaly on, well, just sheer misfortune. For these to work, they demand centralized control, rock-solid credibility, and massive multi-channel support.
When you look at modern hybrid warfare, it's fascinating how these elements stack up. Take the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Actors used genuine confidential user data, which is malinformation, as the lure. And because the data was real, it had immense credibility, which meant it slipped right past the audience's natural defense mechanism of selective attention. Once they mapped out those psychological vulnerabilities, boom! Deliberate disinformation was deployed across multiple channels to totally manipulate user behavior.
Section 5, the tactics of persuasion. Okay, we've looked at the macro theories and the grand strategy. Now let's get down to the ground level and look at the exact tactical weapons being used on us every day.
Harold Lasswell gave us the ultimate framework for analyzing propaganda. Who says what, in which channel, to whom, and with what effect? Underneath all that, propaganda is stratified by its source. You have white propaganda, where the source is open, honest, and promotes generally positive objectives; gray propaganda, where the source is ambiguous and you can't quite check the truth; and then black propaganda, deliberate lies and totally faked sources designed to maliciously mislead you. Pushing through Lasswell's channels, propagandists rely on 7 core tactical techniques to shape how we perceive things. They are plain folks, card stacking, bandwagon, name-calling, glittering generalities, transfer, and testimonial. By leveraging these specific tactics, bad actors can feed highly curated symbols right into our media ecosystem, nudging our behavior exactly where they want it to go.
Let's look at some documented examples from Malaysian politics to see this in real life. The plain folks technique is everywhere as white or gray propaganda. Think of political figures suddenly wearing cheap bata slippers or riding a bicycle to the market. It downplays their elite status to build immediate trust. Then you have card stacking. This is when highly selective manifesto data or perfectly curated pie charts are blasted to the public to mathematically project this biased sense of inevitability. It skews reality while sounding completely credible.
And this builds perfectly into the bandwagon effect. This leverages our primal, hardwired instinct to just follow the crowd. Picture those massive aerial shots of political rallies, a literal sea of uniformly colored shirts. That isn't just about showing off support. It's a tactical, visual consensus designed to directly trigger that spiral of silence we talked about earlier. It makes the opposition feel incredibly small, incredibly isolated, and essentially forces them into silence.
Section 6. Reclaiming your reality. So, as we wrap up our journey through the architecture of information warfare, the big question is, how do we actually defend ourselves?
Back in 1955, the magic bullet theory assumed we were entirely defenseless, just completely passive receptacles for propaganda. But modern research shows a different story. Thanks to information overload, we aren't completely helpless. Instead, we use selective attention. But here's the catch. We often seek out media not to learn anything new, but simply to find psychological reassurance for our existing prejudices. In a way, our own selective attention plays a massive role in our own deception.
Philosopher Eric Hoffer really hit the nail on the head here. He said, "Propaganda does not deceive people, it merely helps them to deceive themselves." Honestly, that captures the entire symbiotic relationship of modern information warfare. The media ecosystem builds the mean world. It lays out the lure. It gives the multi-channel support. But ultimately, it relies on our own cognitive biases to snap the trap shut.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought. As you scroll through your feeds today, looking at the news, the rallies, the data, is the media actually deceiving you? Or are you willingly consuming the exact, tailored propaganda that perfectly fits your constructed reality? Understanding these frameworks is the first vital step to taking your perception back. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning everything.